Let's talk about multiple document interface applications, or MDI forms. And let's go into Visual Studio and see what that looks like. So here we have a blank Visual Studio application. And what we're going to do is change this from being an SDI application, single document interface application, to being an MDI application. So I'm going to go into its properties. And this one's a little tricky. This is sort of a strangely named property. It's the only one that starts with the word is. So instead of being an MDI container, so you see it here, instead of being MDI container true and false, it's is MDI container. And so what I'm going to do, as you can see, the default is false. What I'm going to do is change that to true. And that changes the look of the window so that you can tell, or the form, so that you can tell that this is an MDI application. It has a slightly darker gray client area. So let's add a menu strip so I have something to work with to this form. And although we don't generally consider it to be good style to make a menu have a click event, I just need a couple of things to click on here. So I'm going to say create child and double click on that. And so there's the stub for my menu event procedure for creating child. And what I'd like to do here is I'd like to create an instance of a new form. So in order to do that, I have to add that form to my project. So I'll go back to the project and say add, new item, or Windows form or class. They'll all take me to the same place. And I'll just go ahead and leave the name as the default form 2. That'll be my child form. I'll click add. And so that brings up this form. And now that I have that, I can go back to the code and I can say form, and call it child, equals new form 2, like so. You can also make the type of this form 2 if you like, but I'm just showing you that form would work as a base class. Our next step is to cause the form to appear. So in other words, child.show, like so. And let's see how far that takes us. So we'll go ahead and start. And that brings up the application. And I can click on the menu here, execute the event procedure, and that does a show on form 2. And I can, in fact, do that again. So I can make as many copies of that form as I choose to. I could have also shown it as a dialog box if I wanted, but that would be unusual with child MDI document forms. So as you see, I can create as many instances of the form as I like. They're all called form 2 because each instance has the same caption, but they are distinct separate objects. And I can close any of those forms, or if I close the main form, of course, the other two forms disappear as well. Our next step is to attach the forms, the child forms, to their parent. So it actually looks like a properly functioning MDI application. And the way you do that is by setting a property of those forms. So I say child.mdi parent. And I set the child MDI parent as the current form. In other words, my form 1, which is the MDI form, it's the form that has the is MDI container property set to true, will be the parent of the newly created instances of form 2. And with that change, we see this. So I can say create child, and now instead of creating a form that I can move throughout the desktop, that form is constricted, which is to say it's a child form of the main MDI form. I can move it around, but nonetheless, I can't get it outside of the boundaries of the parent form. And if I make this bigger, all it really happens is that I can move the child form a little bit more, but that's it. And I can also minimize it, and it appears at the bottom of the MDI form. And I can create as many of these children inside of the MDI form as they want, and they all maintain their visual position inside of the MDI parent form. So I will close this application, thereby closing all of the children, and make one more modification, and that is I want to be able to get data out of the form. I want to be able to, in other words, communicate back and forth between the parent form and the child form. And the way we do this is we're going to go to the second form, the child form, and we're going to add a form load event procedure. So I double click on the form, that opens up form load, and then let's create a random number. So this is a quick way to get that to happen. And I will take that random number and I will do a modulus operation, let's say modulo 3, and I'll set that equal to my, let's say, color number. That needs to be a method. And then I'll just put a switch statement in here. If the value is 0, I will set the back color property of this form to be, and I'll pick an arbitrary color. And this might be a good place for some constants or an enumeration, but I'm just trying to get the quick demo to work. Something along those lines. So every time you create a child form, it's going to have one of these 3 random colors. So this looks like this. Okay, so now there's something about each form that is distinct to the form, or at least 3 possibilities. Now I want to communicate that back to the parent form. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to add a property that will return that color as a string. So it's going to return a string, and it'll be called back color name. And it will very simply have a get part that will return the back color name. Now the question is, what's the access specifier for this? And of course, our first thought is that it should be public so that this property can be seen outside of the form. And that is fine. You're really not revealing too much. But there is actually a better answer, and that answer is internal. So if you make a property or a method internal, what you're saying is that it is project public. And what I mean by project public is back color name will be available to any other class as long as that class is in the same project. So for example, if this was in a library, I might want to make it internal so that other classes in the same library could access it, but it would not be exported outside of the library. So going back to form 1, I might want to add something that allows us to gather that information. So let's go to design and let's add a report, let's call it, just to keep things simple. And that event procedure will look like this. And what I want to do is I want to look at all of the MDI children associated with this particular MDI form. Okay, that's actually a collection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a for each loop. And I'm going to use that loop to iterate through this collection MDI children. So each of these items in MDI children is a form. So I'll just call it form F in MDI children. And I would want to, oops, I gotta properly case that. And I would want to capture some information, so I'm going to put that information in a string called result. And each time through the loop, I will add to result. And what I'm going to add is f dot back color, like so. Now there's a couple of things to notice here. MDI children is an array of forms, so it makes sense to make your loop parameter of type form. The second thing is form actually already has a back color. So I picked something arbitrary for the example that it turns out is already exported from basic forms. Imagine, though, that you had any other sort of data in a form that was unique to that form. You would need to create one of those properties that your MDI form would have access to. So having said that, let's say I actually want to look at that specific piece of data that is unique to my form. How can I get that access to that information? Well, you've already seen that I can use back color, but again, that's because back color is exported from all forms. If you look at what's actually available, you will not see back color name, which was the custom property that I created for this purpose. So how do we get access to that? Well, there's a couple of ways. One, you could iterate through this list of forms. Instead of being forms, call them form 2, because that's the one that actually has that custom property, back color name, like so. Or if you did want to iterate through them as forms, you can do that as well, but you would need to cast the loop parameter as a form 2. So for our specific example, probably the best thing to do, since we know that all the forms are actually form 2 things, is actually loop through them as form 2. And then you'll be able to get access to your custom property in the most natural way. But in any case, that's how it's set up. And you have both of those options. So if at some point you did actually have a hierarchy of forms, you'd still be able to iterate through them with MDI children. And then you would have to do some downcasting possibly to get to your own unique property. So once we've added that, let me add one other thing. I'm going to add an environment.newLine. So this data comes out on separate lines. And finally, I will report my result in a simple message box. And run the code. So I'll create my children here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or so. And then click report. And you see all the numbers of all the forms one at a time. And of course, there's only 3 individual colors, but of course, there's many more forms. So let's take a quick look at the supplied example. And this is MDI parent-child data sharing. And hopefully at this point, you have some idea of how that application could have been created as we walk through it. So it's very similar to what we saw before. The biggest difference is instead of colors, we're actually using a date time picker. So I can create children, and each of these has an arbitrary date around the time that the application was run. And you can pull the data, which is what we basically did with the colors before. And you can see these are all the timestamps on those particular date time pickers. And we've added an additional property that allows you to push data to these children. So I click push, and now all of their data is exactly the same time. So let's take a look at that code. And here we see the familiar lines: create the form, set its parent, and then do a show. And pull is looping through the MDI children. You'll note the use of active child here. If the active child of an MDI form is equal to null, it means it doesn't have any children. Now, there are actually a couple of other properties that might appear to give you this information, but it turns out that they don't get updated in a timely fashion. So if you want to determine whether or not there are actually any active children at any given time, I suggest the use of active MDI child. And there's also a push data that allows you to put data into a given form, in this case, an MDI child form, again, using those custom properties that you create for that purpose. And we can see those here by opening up the code for Form 2. And in this case, I've created a simple internal date time timestamp property that allows you to get the value and to set the value. But the only difference with this particular example versus the one we created before was that we're using a date time picker, and we actually have a set part of our custom property. Okay, so that's MDI applications. The important points to take away here is in order to turn a form into an MDI container, you set the isMDI container property to true. Then you can create your new form and set its MDI parent property to the parent form, which in this case would be using the this keyword. Then you create internal properties on your child form. You can iterate through the list of all the MDI children associated with an MDI parent using MDI children data structure. And if you want to determine whether or not there are actually MDI children at any given time, use the active MDI child property. And that's MDI applications.